Thank you very much, particularly to see such a large crowd of students here. It's, as someone who teaches, I really enjoy my presentations and interactions with young people because you are the future. And my hope is that universities are places of learning theory, practice, but also conscientizing you to go out and change the world. This is the ultimate goal for, no matter what field we work in, that we would like to change the reality of the world that we live in. So, you want to check?
Ora vi chiediamo se è tutto chiaro, riuscite a seguirla o volete la traduzione? No? Tutti tranquilli? Okay, so just speak very slowly. You're very clear, so just speak slowly. Okay.
Thank you very much also to the university for two things, actually, for inviting me and then making it possible for me to conduct a meeting with civil society organizations before I came to this forum, and I apologize, we ran a little bit late, but there were some very interesting associations there sharing information. As has been mentioned, my mandate is looking at violence against women, its causes and consequences. So that's a large mandate. It means that I cannot look at the issue of violence against women in isolation of context, in isolation of women's realities when it comes to equality, non-discrimination, and basic human rights. So my mandate comes from, it's 17 years old. It started with the Commission on Human Rights within the UN system, passing a resolution to create this mandate. It's one of the older mandates. It's a recognition that violence against women is a global phenomenon. It isn't about pink, black, white, blue people. It isn't about the global north or the global south. It isn't about a particular culture or religion or tradition. It's a global phenomenon. It does manifest in different ways, in different locations. The prevalence rates are higher in some places than others. And so the mandate looks at all spheres of violence. So looking at causes and consequences means looking at what are the structural systemic problems, what are the root causes, and this mandate has looked at that over 17 years, and I continue to do that in the last 2.5 years. There are four main activities that I've been mandated with by the Human Rights Council, which is the new UN entity that I report to. And broadly, the four activities are conducting missions to different countries, like the one I'm doing. These are official missions at the invitation of the government. To start the process, would send a request to a government saying that I would like to conduct a mission, and a response, a positive response, means that I can come into the country. No response means I cannot. So I cannot go into a country on an official mission unless the government issues an invitation. The Italian government was very responsive last year when I sent in the request. I've got an invitation within a week. Which is an indicator of a government's commitment to its international obligations. The system under which I fall is a system called special procedures, and this is a system that many governments find difficult because we are regarded as the eyes and ears of the human rights system. We can go to places, we can say things about a country, about a situation, with respect, of course, but not being restricted in many ways. We can go to a country that is not a party to any international instrument. So when I talk about international instruments, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, a government does not have to be party to those instruments for someone from special procedures to go to the country to examine a situation. There are about 40 of us in the system holding different mandates. Sometimes the mandate is a thematic focus, like my mandate, which is on violence against women, causes and consequences. Sometimes it's a geographic mandate. The last geographic mandate that was created was one on Iran. I think there's one on Syria now. So you can have a geographic mandate or you can be a thematic mandate holder. There are other mechanisms within special procedures called working groups. So there's a working group on arbitrary detention, a working group on laws and practices that discriminate against women. That's a new working group that was created last year, has a really important function and role to play. On the other spectrum of the human rights world are what we call the treaty bodies. And the treaty bodies are committees created in terms of specific treaties. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has a committee on discrimination against women, and some of you may have heard the acronym CEDAW. Italy reported last year to CEDAW in terms of its obligations, and the treaty bodies cannot look at reports if a country is not a party to the treaty. So that's part of international law. The treaty bodies also cannot entertain a complaint from an individual, an organization, an institution, unless all domestic remedies have been exhausted. So that's the difference with special procedures, where a country does not have to be a party to an international instrument, and you do not have to exhaust your local remedies before a mandate like mine can look at an issue. So the first sphere is formal missions to countries. I conduct 2 or 3 missions a year. Because of finance constraints by the High Commissioner's Office. I should go back a step. I am not an employee of the United Nations. I am not an employee of any government or civil society organization. I am what is called an independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council. We do not get an income from the United Nations or any government. We expect it to live on love and fresh air, of course, doing this work. So it's basically doing voluntary work for the UN, but it is about our commitment to a cause that many of us continue to do this. I teach part-time at the university so I can pay my rent and pay my bills, but the large part of my work is this. So part of the legitimacy and the credibility of the special procedures system is that we do not have the association with the United Nations as employees or with any government. And it's part of why our reports are trusted in many contexts. So the missions are at the invitation of a government. I write a report which is tabled with the Human Rights Council in June of each year. I also report to the General Assembly, which means in October of each year I provide a synopsis of my activities, including my missions, to the General Assembly. I also report to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, and I provide a synopsis. At the informal level, I have an agreement with the CEDAW committee where I meet with them behind closed doors once a year in New York, and we share information on the human rights issues that I am encountering in the different countries that I go to. So that's where my reports are tabled. I make recommendations in my reports for the government of Italy, for civil society organizations sometimes. If I've seen some challenges that I think need to be addressed, I make recommendations for the international community, particularly the donor community in certain countries, and for UN entities as well, the Secretariat of the UN, where there are programs. So my recommendations are tabled in a report. My recommendations in the report are not enforceable by me. I cannot force a government to follow up on the recommendations that I make because I do not have the power in terms of the resolution that created the mandate. But as many of you know, the UN is not a separate autonomous entity. The UN is a government of governments. And the UN is a political entity. At the secretariat level is an administrative entity. But many of the administrative entities in the UN tend to look at the recommendations and see what they can do at the country level. So the reports serve a purpose. The treaty bodies use our reports as well, because we can go to places, we can say things that they cannot do. So the missions are the first activity. The second activity is receiving individual complaints. And as I mentioned, because you do not have to exhaust your domestic remedies and go through the court system or your human rights systems, there can be direct complaints to the mandate. And my response on receiving complaints is to investigate a little bit, but to send a letter to the government asking about the allegation that I've received and asking some questions, but linking the allegation to the international obligations of the state, and whether they are meeting or failing to meet their obligations. The communication procedure that I'm talking about has a response rate of about 25 to 33%. It's not great to, receive a response from governments that is as low as that. Again, unfortunately, we cannot enforce and insist that government responds to our allegations. And, so for the students here, you'd be asking, so what's the value of this? The value of it is that it makes an issue visible, a national issue visible at the international level, when complaints are received and when I send a letter of communication to the government. These communications that I receive, the letter that I send to government, and any response that I receive is then tabled in a dedicated communication report, which is tabled with the Human Rights Council in June. It's a public document. It goes on the website of the High Commissioner. And again, when we think about these reports, whether it's a country mission report, whether it's a communication letter, these are important human rights documents that name and shame a government and its failure to protect, its failure to prevent violations, etc. It becomes a public record for other governments to pick up and hopefully do some accountability. But it also means that at a national level, human rights activists can use these instruments as accountability tools. And these reports are all public documents on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner in Geneva. The third activity that I conduct as part of my mandate is very much a point that you made about research. The Human Rights Council, I am mandated once a year to write a thematic report which pushes the conceptual understandings and boundaries on my subject matter of violence against women. And every year I table a report to the Human Rights Council in June, a thematic report. My country mission reports are separate reports. My first report to the Council was in 2010, where I tabled a report on reparations. My work on reparations was linked to the fact that we don't have a common understanding globally on reparations. So reparations is seen as something that happens in post-conflict societies. Reparations is often seen as compensation, as money. And my report in 2010 on reparations argues, and reparations is a due diligence obligation that a state has in terms of international law. And I argue in that report that reparations for all forms of violence against women is crucial, not only in post-conflict societies. Reparations needs to be looked at through a gender lens, is the second point I make. Also, that reparations needs to look beyond compensation, because reparations is about simple things like acknowledgement of harm. It's about a responsive justice system that doesn't re-victimize a person. It's about apologies. It's about memorialization. It's about a never again. So reparations can serve a purpose of never again, that we do want to end these phenomena in our societies, but we need to do it in a way that acknowledges the structural harm as well as the individual harm. It needs to move away from thinking about it as compensation. In 2011, last year, I tabled a report looking at multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination against women and the nexus with violence against women. And in that report, I argue that no government in the world is having success in eliminating violence against women. And that's because all governments adopt a one-size-fits-all programmatic approach. Their programmatic approach is based on the fact that, on their reasoning that all women are the same and all violence is the same. So treating women as homogeneous and treating violence as homogeneous. And I argue there that as long as we don't look at the layers and layers of discrimination, of inequality, and the multiple layers and the nexus with violence, no government will succeed in successfully addressing violence against women in any context. This year, my report to the Council in June of this year will be looking at the issue of the killings of women globally. I know there's been an increase in the prevalence rates in Italy of femicide, of women being killed. But I've also been to El Salvador and other countries where the prevalence rates are increasing. The manifestations, the reasons are different in some countries, but the bottom line is that women are being killed by people that they know, in most instances, in different parts of the world. Part of my motivation of looking at the global killings of women is that there is a tendency in different parts of the world to look at the killings of women as happening in certain regions of the world. So the so-called phenomena of honor killings, of honor crimes, there's a view in some parts of the world that that's the most horrendous form that we see, and it happens because of people's religion or culture. That isn't so. I conducted a mission in November to Jordan, and I was shocked that the prevalence rate is between 10 and 20 women per year being killed. But it's easier to point fingers and say, this is about them, they're different from us, whether it's because of their race or their religion or their culture or their ethnicity, that they're different and it happens there. But it happens in Italy as well. I'm sure if by the time I finish the mission, I will get statistics that will show me that the rate of women being killed in Italy, and I'm talking about Italian women, I'm not talking about minority communities, migrants, Roma, Sinti, other migrants. I'm talking about Italian women. I'm sure it's going to be more than 20 women a year that are being killed. So I think, part of my global perspective is that we need to contextualize these issues and not make it about the other. It isn't about the other based on skin color, on race, on ethnicity, on culture, religion, tradition. It's happening in all communities in the world. I'm looking in that report at dowry-related deaths in India, Bangladesh, Nepal. I'm looking in that report at the issue of witchcraft violence, where women are being identified as witches and being killed. Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Central Africa, Ghana, it's happening in different parts of the world. I'm looking at the issue of the killings of lesbians in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in other parts of the world, where women, because of sexual orientation, are being abused and being killed in these parts of the world. I'm also looking at the issue of the disappearances and killings of Aboriginal women in Canada. I'm looking at what's going on in Central America, Latin America, the phenomena of feminicide, the linking of the murders of women to drug cartels, to other issues. So this report will come out in June of this year, and I do want to say to the United Nations, to member states, that this is something we ought to be concerned about. It's a huge problem. So thematic reports are the third aspect of my work. The fourth aspect is meetings such as this. Often I go to conferences, I go to meetings, I go to regional networks invite me to come and hear what's going on either at a country level or at a regional level, and that's the fourth part of my work. What are the spheres of violence that I look at? I look at 4 spheres of violence. Violence against women in the home, domestic violence, femicide, etc. And I look at domestic violence in all its manifestations, psychological, economic, physical, etc. But I also look at the girl child. There's no way that I can ignore in some countries what is happening with the girl child, although it's strictly not part of my mandate, but the girl child is the woman of the future. And I think of that aspect of my work as preventative work. So I look at issues of incest, child abuse, particularly against the girl child. I also look at the issue of forced and early marriages. I look at female genital mutilation in different contexts. The second sphere of violence that I look at is violence against women in the community. And this can be sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual offenses against women in the community. I look at trafficking, but minimally, because there is a special rapporteur on trafficking whose focus is this. But when I'm in a country, I look at the issue and it becomes part of my report, but it's also passed on to the expert whose field this is. The third sphere of violence that I look at is violence against women that is perpetrated by the state. And this is violence that occurs against women through the lens of a continuum, both in terms of time and space. I do not believe that the violence that we see in conflict situation just comes about because there's a conflict situation. I see it as linked to systemic structural problems that have occurred already in homes, in communities, etc. So I look at violence through the lens of a continuum in time and in space. Whether it's in times of peace, I call it so-called peace, because there can't be peace when 50% of a country's population is experiencing violence in some form or the other. So in times of so-called peace, in times of conflict, post-conflict, and also societies in transition. I was in Somalia in December on mission, and looking at a country like Somalia, 20-year civil war, hugely displaced populations living in camps, but also asking, and I went to the capital, to Mogadishu and to other places. I didn't conduct the mission sitting in Kenya. I actually went into Somalia to interview people and to look at the situation. But I could walk away from the media reports telling me that in Somalia, the biggest problem is sexual violence in IDP camps, in internally displaced camps. That isn't true. There's a privatization of violence that occurs during conflict as well. The violence that is going on in the homes that people are not talking about, because the violence outside is so pervasive, so prevalent, so traumatic that people don't talk about what's going on in the private spaces. And so one of the questions that I was asking in Somalia is, what is going on in Somali homes? Okay, I understand what's going on in the IDP camps and the sexual violence, which the media covers, but what else is going on in Somalia? I mean, one is the impact of a 20-year civil war, but there's something else going on as well. So those are the four spheres that I look at. I've spoken about my thematic reports. My reports, as I mentioned, are tabled with the Human Rights Council as my primary accountability body, and the recommendations there. My work is underpinned, because it's a global position, I look at the issue of what is a country's international obligations. Now, there is no compulsion on any country to sign any treaty. Countries do that voluntarily. Countries, when they sign and take on international law, it's a voluntary act. Sometimes there is, the global pressure of doing the right thing, but it is a voluntary act. But it shouldn't be a voluntary act that stops at signature and ratification. How do we give life to those obligations? And that's what I try and do through the lens of, in law, we call it the due diligence obligations of states. And when it comes to violence against women, the due diligence obligations have four components: prevention, protection, punishment, and provision of reparations. And I look at and when I come into a country, I look at these four aspects of the obligations of a government and ask questions in terms of prevention, protection, punishment, and provision of reparations, of where a country is at and whether it's meeting its obligations. I am not Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. I do my work through a lens of a dialogical process with a government. So it's not about naming and shaming only. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about how can we have a constructive dialogue so that the realities of women on the ground can change. And so part of this mission is to have constructive dialogues at the state level, but at the non-state level as well. Part of today's presentation is to speak to faculty, to speak to academics, to students, about your interest in the issue of violence against women, whether you currently work on it or not, and how do you see the manifestations of violence in Italy and the human rights violations. How do you see that in relation to Italy's regional obligations in terms of the Council of Europe, the European Union, but also in relation to the UN? And whether you have views about the Italian situation in general when it comes to women, women's human rights, but more broadly, if you have international information, that would be useful. So there will be, hopefully, time for questions. I'm going to stop here now, and we can have a dialogue after we have the next two presentations. Thank you very much for listening.